everyone, and welcome to this webinar about establishing a PPP framework. My name is Jen, and I'm going to be your host for today's session. Before I get started, can I do a quick check if everyone can hear and see me okay? Good, I see yes in the chat, so you have obviously found that. So thank you so much for joining today. Let me put the slides towards full screen so we can get started and showcase the webinar that we're going to talk about today. As you will see on the left-hand side in your window, throughout the session, you can ask questions. There are a variety of different chat options available, and you can see a number of different ways in which you can work together to ask questions, and I strongly encourage you to do that throughout the rest of the session. Good. In this webinar today, we're going to make you familiar with the basic ideas behind the establishment of a PPP framework. So as a short agenda for today's session, I'm going to get started with providing you with a brief introduction towards the basic concept of a PPP. We're going to be looking at what are the components that make up public-private partnerships. And we're even more importantly going to look at where are some of the critical issues that most PPPs are facing. After that topic, I will dive into the main topic of this webinar today, and that is how do you then subsequently establish a well-defined and mature PPP framework. We're going to be looking at some of the critical components of what those frameworks need to establish. And immediately after that, I will introduce a critical topic, which I call PPP framework maturity. Key outcome of this lecture today is that you have a bit of a better understanding of how these kinds of frameworks need to be set up, but also that you have a bit of a better understanding on what would be the steps with which you could establish this in better detail. These are some of the key topics that we're going to be discussing today. At the end of this session, I'm going to give everyone the opportunity to ask questions, and I will try to moderate them towards the end so that there's a good going back and forth between any outstanding questions that you might have based on the session today. Let me get started with providing a very brief introduction about myself so that you know who will be delivering the webinar today. I saw quite a number of familiar faces already or familiar names within the chat. So just as a quick introduction about myself, my name is Jan Willem. I'm one of the co-founders of Cybiant, and I'm presenting today from Kuala Lumpur. I'm also one of the first certified PPP trainers in Asia Pacific, and was one of the persons who launched the PPP certification program in Asia Pacific in 2017. And I do a lot of PPP training. I see some of you who are on the session today are some of my previous students, so thanks so much for listening in again. And as part of our mission to share best practices, what we're doing is we're training and educating people on how do you take the first steps with public-private partnerships. On the left-hand side of this slide, you will see all of my contact details. So after the session, if you want to be in touch, or if you have any additional material or questions, or you would like to get a copy of the slides, please, by all means, do send me a message, and I'll be happy to share it with you. Good. This webinar is provided by Cybiant. Our company focuses on best practices and ensuring that organizations can work based upon those best practices. And today what I'm going to show you is how do you apply best practices within the PPP domain. Within our company, we are doing a lot of work around best practices, ranging from project management towards IT services, towards architecture, and the way in which you can set up quality systems. If you think about very deeply around the way that public-private partnerships are structured, is that ultimately this is also a best practice approach. Many governments across the world are struggling with the same or similar issues when it comes towards setting up good public-private partnerships. There are quite a number of lessons and best practices that can be learned from the projects that have been conducted in the past, but also approaches that different governments are taking across the world. Some countries have very mature PPP frameworks, whereas other countries are just getting started and are in the process of establishing the steps to build up a more rigorous and rigid framework. So what we're going to be doing today is that we're going to show you some of those steps, and I will also showcase you a particular approach, which is what we call the maturity index, that you could take within your jurisdiction in order to structurally improve those best practices when it comes towards excellence in public-private partnership. So let me get started all the way at the beginning. Some of you might be very familiar with PPPs. Some of you might be completely new towards the concept. But I always like to start off any kind of webinar by making sure that everyone is on the same page when it comes towards crucial definitions and crucial concepts that we would need to discuss. So we're going to get started with giving you a bit of a better and more in-depth background around what a public-private partnership actually is. What is it that we're talking about when we're talking about PPPs? And on this next slide, you see the official definition by the World Bank, and that's also the definition that we're using within the PPP guide. It's quite a long sentence to basically explain the definition of a PPP, but it's very crucial. And for that reason, I've highlighted a couple of key things that I think everyone should be familiar with, especially at the start of this webinar, because if you don't truly understand what a PPP is, it's going to be very difficult to have a discussion around how to set up a framework. So in essence, the public-private partnership is a contract. And it's obviously a contract between a public and a private sector company. But what makes the PPP contract type relatively unique is that it's a different form of contract. What you see that I've highlighted here on the slide is that a PPP contract is not just for the development of infrastructure, because those kind of contracts have been around for, well, probably hundreds, if not thousands of years. But it also includes the management of the public asset over its entire life cycle. And that means that ultimately you're moving into a contract for a very long term, because the life cycle and management of that contract can be stretching decades or even longer than that. What makes the PPP contract unique in its sense is not just because that development and operations is all combined into one contractual form, but that it is a contract that is specifically created to create a win-win situation between the public and the private side. And that's what you see highlighted in the second part of this slide, which I highlighted in blue. And that is that we need to find a way or a contractual form in which we find a way in which the private sector is significantly at risk for the duration of the contract, but also is rewarded if the execution of that contract is going well. A good PPP contract, for that reason, will always be focused around a win-win situation. In the PPP contract, what is also unique is that we're going to ask the private sector to put their money where their mouth is. And that means that as a private sector company, you need to be responsible or at least liable for a significant portion of the finance. That means that if the private sector actually invests in the project itself, they will have a very, very strong incentive to make sure that the project is going to be successful. Otherwise, they might risk of losing their initial investment. So those are two relatively unique properties when it comes towards PPPs. The last key element of the definition, as you can see here highlighted on the slide in purple, is that within the PPP contract, we also want to make sure that the remuneration, and therefore obviously the profit margins, are going to be linked towards performance. So ultimately that means that if the private sector is doing a very good job or an above average job, is that they're going to be rewarded towards a more significant extent than if the performance is poor. Within those constraints, and within the constraints of creating this win-win situation, that's the essence of what a PPP is going to be about. And even though I'm fully aware that across the world there are different implementations or different versions of this definition, this is the essence of what we're trying to accomplish. And if you think about that a little bit more deeply, you will immediately see that there are quite a number of elements already that we can put into a framework. Because how are we going to define what is significant risk? How are we going to make sure that across all of the projects in the country, we're going to have a system that incentivizes performance in a consistent way? You might already guess it, but obviously these are all critical aspects that need to be defined in a nation's national framework regarding PPPs. And we're going to look today a little bit deeper on how do you ensure that that can be done in a consistent, reliable, and fair way. Good. Now that you know a little bit more around the definition of a public-private partnership, there is a very strong analogy that I always like to make when it comes towards PPPs. And that's probably an analogy that if you've been on one of my courses before, you've heard me talk about before. But a public-private partnership has a lot, from a contractual point of view, a lot of very strong similarities with a marriage contract. Because if you look at the previous slides and the word that I highlighted in the different colors, you can basically see that a marriage contract has very, very similar characteristics. It's also a contract between two parties that sometimes have conflicting or different objectives. It's hopefully a long-term contract. From a legal perspective, a lot changes when you get married. So there is new rules and regulations that get into place as soon as you get married. And ultimately, within a marriage contract, there is also a significant risk transfer to either side. You're promising to take care of each other and making sure that you spend the rest of each other's lives, even regardless of certain situations that might arise. So just like a public-private partnership, a marriage contract is also a contract that is specifying a win-win situation between all of the parties involved. Ultimately, that leads towards the alignment and the interests of both parties towards a long-term and successful execution of that contract. I always like to make this analogy because it kind of fairly matches the way that a public-private partnership comes into place. Do you define all of the different potential situations that might arise within situations that might change? Think about a COVID pandemic, or think about the economic situation in particular countries. The answer to both these contracts is obviously yes. You will make certain provisions for if things don't work out, if there are going to be significant events. How do you deal with that? So the contract and the structure of the collaboration needs to provide enough justification to make sure that you can be dealing with unforeseen circumstances. However, you don't over-specify it. There is not one way, because it's a long-term contract, a lot can happen in a lot of years, that will always provide for all kinds of situations. And that's where the last P of public-private partnerships comes in. Ultimately, and a lot of companies that I've been working with tend to kind of forget this, the last P of PPPs stands for partnership. And it means that if you get into a situation which is either unforeseen, unexpected, or a completely different change of a situation, you need to work together as partners in order to find a suitable way to get out of that. So I think that this always fairly matches the way that PPP contracts and marriage contracts align. However, I would strongly advise you not to make this analogy back at home. So don't tell your spouse this, because they might have a different opinion around the way that a marriage contract is executed. Good. So now that you are a little bit more familiar with the basic elements, and there's a lot of reasons why PPPs have become very popular. and also quite successful within recent years. Some of the benefits of those you see listed on this slide, and the more traditional benefits are obviously the potential access to capital, especially for countries who don't or who have more tight budget constraints. But also one of the primary reasons why PPPs are used is that it provides an opportunity for the government to leverage innovation that is done within private sector companies and to learn and experience what that innovation can bring towards government projects. The benefits that you typically see within public-private partnerships is that if you create this win-win situation, you're getting best of both worlds. The private sector is able to have the security of longer-term commitments, whereas the government is able to leverage innovation or set up a structure which they ultimately would not be able to accommodate by themselves. And throughout this partnership, there is a lot of, obviously, if it goes well, there's a lot of execution in terms of ideas, a win-win situation where all of the different parties have the ability to fare well with this arrangement. However, if you look a little bit more closely towards some of the benefits of public-private partnerships, you can ultimately at the same time also see that where those benefits apply, there's also an equal amount of risk. Because if you're getting into this longer-term contract, it means that you also cannot exit that contract very quickly. The fact that there is a lot of access to capital also means that there's also a lot of capital at risk. The fact that the private sector will share innovation also means that there is a risk for them of jeopardizing or losing their intellectual property. So the key point I want to make with this slide is that even though we always tend to focus around the benefits of PPPs, the same benefits typically are also immediately the risks. And the reason that this is important is that you would need to come up with a structure in order to manage these benefits and risks within a way that is acceptable for all parties involved. So that's what we're going to be looking at next, is how do you do that? How can you make sure that that can be done in an adequate way? In order to understand where these risks are coming into play, I always like to show you this picture, which basically gives an explanation of what a public-private partnership is in just one simple image. And at the center of a PPP, you see the contract that is closed between the private party, which you see in the middle of the slide, and the government, which is depicted at the top, or the public authority. That contract, which is known as the upstream contract, is basically guiding the roles and responsibilities as well as the monetary streams between the two parties involved. It's subsequently necessary for the private partner to start making the arrangements for the execution and fulfillment of that contract. And this is typically done by including finance in terms of equity investors and lenders, and then subsequently making contracts with third-party contractors, which we refer to as the downstream contracts, for the construction, operation, and maintenance of the project. I could probably talk about this slide for around half an hour in order to explain all of the different streams between the different parties involved. But I hope that with this picture, you're getting the main idea of the way that public-private partnerships are structured. One of the other reasons why I'm showing you this is to make you realize that within the PPP, there's a variety of different stakeholders. And that equally brings a lot of risk towards any of the parties involved. All of the parties involved therefore want to make sure that there's adequate arrangements around rights, roles, and responsibilities, so that this complex structure, which a PPP almost by definition always is, can be managed and governed accordingly. And that brings me towards one of the main talks and thoughts that I would like to share with you today. And that is the following question that I have seen in a lot of different countries and a lot of jurisdictions within the last few years. Almost everyone, even if you don't know anything about PPPs, is convinced that a PPP framework is a cornerstone of the successful execution of a public-private partnership. That is not under debate. A lot of governments have realized that this needs to be established, it needs to be developed, and that a framework requires constant updates and further development for it to remain active policy and to make sure that lessons are learned for a longer period of time. However, the question that I've received very, very frequently is, well, now that we know that this framework is necessary, how do we ensure that we can build it in a very consistent, measurable, and repeatable way? And that's really where the difficulty is. There's not just one way to establish this framework. There's not just one single way in which this should be executed. And that basically was a question that really intrigued me for a very long time, is how can we bring consistency within this domain of PPPs, and how can we make sure that there is a way that is not just consistent, but also measurable? So how can we ensure that that can be created? And that is basically one of the critical questions that I would like to deal with next, is what does a good PPP framework look like? So if you look at the input, which is all the points that you see on the left, and then on the right-hand side, you see the outcome. That is the PPP framework that I will discuss in the next few slides. The critical way that we started to envision and start to define that is by looking at what are key measurable things. So we started based upon the premise of a number of very simple statements, and you see those listed here on the slide. First and foremost, note, as we've seen in the previous few slides, that whenever we are talking about a PPP, whether it's infrastructure, but also for social projects, you see that the risk is significant. We are typically not talking about a number of hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's typically around millions, if not tens or hundreds of millions. So it's a very significant risk with these kinds of projects. And the key thing to realize is that that risk is not just there for the private sector, it's also there for the government. So it's in everyone's best interest to make sure that there is a way of working in which everyone will achieve those win-win outcomes. So in order to structure a framework, we would need to think about how can we create an environment in which this win-win situation will work. The second key element that you should understand around a framework is that there is a very significant incentive for all parties involved that PPPs are planned, prepared, and executed successfully. Meaning that the more work is done upfront in order to mitigate or identify potential risks, the less likely it is that these PPPs will fail. So a second crucial reason for establishing a framework is that it will ensure that all the due diligence is done before a project is actually executed. And by setting up rules, policies, and regulations in order to control that, it will become easier once the contract gets towards definition and ultimately signing stage. If all parties involved have done their adequate homework defined by a PPP framework, it becomes easier to control that in the longer run. And then, last but not least, in order to ensure that a PPP is planned, prepared, and executed successfully, there needs to be a structure in place that is building up on existing legislation, preparatory activities, but also on collective expertise. And it's frequently that collective expertise which is the main bottleneck. People come for a specific duration towards a particular project based upon their own individual expertise. They work on that project, and then either as a contractor or as an individual, and then after the project has been closed, that individual moves towards another project, maybe in a different country, or maybe even in a completely different government organization. So the collective expertise and experience with building up PPPs in the longer run is a crucial area to address. So what I've tried to do on this slide is provide you with some of the key inputs that led towards how do you establish a good PPP framework. And that ultimately led towards the creation of the model that I'm going to introduce to you in the next few slides. And that is the model that you see on the right. And if I enlarge that a little bit more in detail, I would like to introduce you towards this model, which we refer to as the maturity index. And it basically establishes what are the crucial and critical components that you would need in order to build up a more mature PPP framework. The first time that you're seeing this picture, it kind of looks maybe a little bit complex because there's all of these interdependencies between all of the crucial components. But if you take a bit of a step back and look at the different colors in the color scheme, it basically means that there are 5 critical categories that you would need to start building up maturity and expertise in order to ensure that your framework gets more rooted into a structural and repeatable manner. And those 5 categories are strategy, governance, execution, processes, and the framework itself. And the framework that you see here depicted in pink is more reflected as the legislative framework. And the crucial point to understand is that all of these 5 components work together. They interact with each other, and there's dependencies between each of these different elements. And that also means that you cannot really consider all of those categories individually. It's not possible to say, well, we have a mature framework if you don't have a good PPP strategy. It's not possible to set up governance without processes in place. It's not possible to execute a PPP well if it's not based upon a long-term strategy. So all of the arrows that you see within this model basically depict the dependencies. And that's immediately why we refer to this as a maturity model, because the word maturity means you're growing over time. It is something that you can build up in a step-by-step approach, and you need to build up all of those components simultaneously. Sometimes you might do some improvements, let's say, on your governance structure, sometimes on your processes, but overall, these different areas need to grow together. So the last key thing that you're seeing in this picture is that all the way at the bottom, you see supporting processes. Supporting processes are not necessarily a specific PPP capability, but they need to be there. And these processes, like for instance, an adequate procurement process, are very significant processes that are underpinning the success of public-private partnerships. So that's the reason why we've not selected them as an individual category, but more as supporting processes that will support all of those 5 different capabilities in their own right. And that's really how this whole model came together. So how do we build this? Where did it come from? Well, basically, this model is the result of all the projects that we've done within public-private partnership domain, and also the collective questions and expertise that we received over those years. So each of these different categories reflects a critical component of the framework, and that needs to be built up over a longer period of time. The whole idea, if you want to understand how do you establish and build up this framework in more depth, is that you start looking at the relationships, the different components together. And by doing that, you get a system that is more measurable, it's more repeatable, and it's also something that you can very easily discuss with other colleagues or other governments, because everyone will, based upon this framework, understand what you're talking about when it comes towards PPPs. Good, so if I can summarize in just a couple of key points what I've just explained, the PPP maturity index that I showed on the previous slide consists of 22 different management processes. So those 22 different management processes are subdivided around those 5 categories that I just shown. But there's also 8 supporting process areas, and I will show you an example with that about those in the next few slides. So in total, we are getting towards an overview of 30 different practices and processes. These practices and processes are subdivided over 5 categories and across 5 different levels. And that kind of requires a little bit more explanation. Because when we're talking about maturity, it means that you can measure where you are on a particular skill. The skill that we've used for the establishment of this framework is the very famous CMMI Capability Maturity Index. And the Capability Maturity Index is based upon 5 different levels, ranging from 0, which is basically non-existent and therefore not depicted on this slide, all the way towards optimized. So throughout that journey, for each of those different levels, you're going to performed, managed, defined, managed, and optimized. And that means that processes start at a non-existent or start in a non-existent way. But as you're progressing over time, they will become more and more structured. And by including newer structures in place, it becomes possible to measure that capability at different levels. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you see those different perspectives. So if I can give you just a very brief overview of what each of those levels entails, is if you think about, let's say, your governance category, if we say that that is executing at a perform level, then there is a way of procuring infrastructure, but it's just one way. There's not a specific focus on it. It is just like any other procurement option in place. And that's obviously a sign that PPPs are not valued more strategically than other procurement options, and that there might be an indication that there's a lack of a more overall system in place. When we're moving towards the second level is that there is more awareness around the importance, and there is a will to strengthen these different elements. Then those are the things that we kind of want to have in place. Good. Let me have a quick question in place. Good. Then the third level is at the defined level, and that is where PPPs are treated as a critical component of the government's infrastructure agenda. And last but not least, there are critical advances towards where the interests might be going. Good. Last but not least, if we are looking at the way in which these categories are going and in which these processes are being extracted, is what we're seeing that there are these 5 supporting categories which can all be subdivided into a number of different categories. And these categories themselves are things like, let's take for example the top one, which is strategy, is that we're looking at strategy management, policy communication, the business case for a public-private partnership, as well as program funding. And for each of those different elements, you will start to see that there are different relationships between those different individuals, as well as the different ways in which they're being supported. So each of those 5 different categories can be broken down into a number of different elements themselves, and can subsequently be subdivided into those 22 different categories that I mentioned earlier. So each different category will have around 4 to 5 different categories that we're going to be looking at. Good. So how do you measure this? How can you make sure that this is done in an effective way? Well, basically, we automatically measure this through a tool which is called Cybiant ADA. ADA stands for Assessment Development Application. And with this tool, we are able to identify where are different things coming from, and where, how can you measure these in a very structured and standardized way. So by all means, we're going to be running a pilot with free access towards this tool. So if you're interested after this webinar to participate in that, by all means, feel free to contact me, and I'm very happy to provide you access to this tool as well. So I hope that in this last 35, 40 minutes, you got a bit of a better understanding of what does it mean to build up a PPP maturity framework. I'm strongly going to encourage you to stay involved, join more of our knowledge sharing sessions, and read something more around some of our PPP case studies. Here you will find some crucial information around how you can get started with PPPs yourself, and also more explanation on frameworks and the way that they are being structured and composed.